So yeah. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. We know a lot of you are joining from different parts of the world. My name is Prof. Nayak, and I'm at the University of Waterloo in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development. I also represent the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, which is a partnership of more than 100 institutions and individuals working on building viable small-scale fisheries in Africa and Asia and globally. So welcome to the thematic webinar series of B2B Global Partnership. I would first introduce the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership and say a few things about the thematic webinar series. Following that, I will introduce our speakers today and then hand it over to our speakers to give their talk. So the Vulnerability to Viability, which we call V2B Global Partnership, is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network of over 100 members from Asia, Africa, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability and viability is not just in the context of economics and related aspects of human life, but all other aspects of small-scale fisheries that includes the human dimensions, the society, culture, politics, and ecology. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fisheries communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance their viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries of Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries of Africa, that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the V2B Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The V2B thematic webinar series, for which we have gathered here today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. The B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will be so throughout 2021. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinars, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to the webinar platform can be found at our website, which is www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's talk is the 8th in the series of webinars planned for the year 2021, and it is my privilege to introduce Professor Emdad Haque and Dr. Mohammed Salim Uddinon as our distinguished speakers today. Professor Chaudhry Emdad Haque is a professor of resource and environmental management at the University of Waterloo, University of Manitoba, my apologies, in Canada. Dr. Mohammed Salim Uddinon is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Waterloo, Canada. Dr. Haque earned his PhD in Geography and Environmental Management from the University of Manitoba and served as the Director of Natural Resources Institute for over a decade from 2001 to 2011. In recognition of research excellence, he was awarded a visiting research fellowship by the University of Oxford, UK in 1995, and the visiting research professorship by the USA-Canada Fulbright Foundation in 2008. He's a co-investigator of such partnership projects on dried fish matters, and also I'm very proud to announce that he is also a co-investigator on the B2B global partnership working on small-scale fisheries issues with all of us. Dr. Haque's research and academic interests focus on social learning from environmental shocks, community resilience to disasters, vulnerability and risk, assessment, common property resources, environmental and resource policy, and climate change adaptation. Two of his recent contributions to the area of environmental hazards from an integrative perspective includes two books that are titled as Hazards in a Fickle Environment, and the second book, which is Disaster Risk and Vulnerability Mitigation Through Mobilizing Community and Partnerships. His contributions include numerous publications and leading several international and national research projects in the area of social learning, environmental hazards, and disaster and governance. Dr. Mohammed Salim Uddinon is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo, and also an adjunct professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences at the University of Winnipeg, Manitoba. He is also an associate fellow at the Center for Asian Climate and Environmental Policy Studies, Windsor, Canada. Dr. Uddinon is pursuing interdisciplinary mixed methods, community-based research on climate change and environmental disasters. His work includes social learning and community resilience to disasters, disaster management, community development, and institutional and policy interventions to climate change adaptations. Dr. Uddinon has been involved in research in Canada, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and India. He is an active member of multiple national and international research forums and professional organizations. So it is my honor today to invite Professor Emdad Haque and Dr. Mohammed Salim Uddinon to deliver a talk for the B2B thematic webinar series. And the talk is entitled as Post-Disaster Livelihood, Reconstruction and Resilience Enhancement by the Small-Scale Fisheries and Transformative Changes in Coastal Bangladesh. Over to you, Dr. Haque and Dr. Uddinon.
Thank you, Dr. Naik.
Good morning and good afternoon, good evening throughout the world. Thank you, Dr. Prof. Nayak, for introducing us to this webinar. It's a pleasure to talk to you about post-disaster livelihood reconstruction and resilience enhancement processes in the context of small-scale fishers and associated transformative changes in the context of coastal Bangladesh. Next slide, please. So in terms of the framing of our presentation, we would like to first present on background and context so that we can understand the processes better, then the conceptual considerations. We will also present our empirical findings. So that's why we'll introduce methodology first, the study areas, sampling procedures, and so on. And then we'll be presenting our results and major findings quite elaborately. And then we'll move to discuss the relevant issues and we'll make the conclusions. And after that, we'll have the opportunity to discuss interactively. It is well known that disaster causes havoc to livelihood. It disrupts people's livelihood by destroying their livelihood means, for example, their houses, their capital. It reduces income, results in enduring poverty and prolonged shocks. So this is well known. What is not well known and well cited, well studied are the details concerning the processes of marginalization as a result of the large scale event. Also, the recovery processes, how long it continues and what kind of pain and what kind of initiative, what kind of proactive ideas and actions are involved. We have very little clue about those processes, and there are big gaps. So it's also well known that coastal communities in the developing countries offer both opportunities and also they are vulnerable to extreme weather. They offer opportunities in terms of fishing opportunities, salt production opportunities, sometimes tourism opportunities, and so on, whereas they're extremely vulnerable to atmospheric and other related hazards and disasters. But the fisher themselves they face specific type of vulnerability. That is because they work in the ocean. They work in the sea, and they often face drowning of their vessels and also themselves. So that destroys their family, and we'll try to dig into those stories. So research on post-disaster recovery in the context of fishers, particularly small-scale fishers, therefore requires to emphasize the process of enhancing victim and community resilience, as well as their adaptation and livelihood reconstruction strategies. That's our scoping today to discuss. In the context of Bangladesh, we can see that the country itself is ranked very high in the Global Climate Risk Index. It is vulnerable to climate-induced extremes. It is also vulnerable to normal atmospheric extreme events like floods, cyclones, storm surges. And one event can cost billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. For example, between 1970 and 2013, more than 700,000 lives lost, 700,000 equivalent to the entire population in Winnipeg, the city I live in. And also it costed more than $7.5 billion, which is a good portion of the GDP. When we look at the impact of these large scale events, disaggregated data for fishers, particularly smaller scale fishers, are generally absent. And only micro or local level investigation, the one that we pursued, can provide clues to map and understand the effects of disasters on smaller scale fishers. That's why we went for more micro level, local studies. So the dynamics of disaster recovery and aspects of community resilience and livelihood reconstruction strategies of the fishers are generally still poorly recorded and understood. And particularly in the Bangladesh context, there are big gaps. Next slide. So let me just briefly talk about the statement of the problem and rationale. We would like to start with two questions. First, how can the local livelihood resilience to disaster shocks, especially of small-scale fishers and other compared groups, for example, small farmers or daily laborers, can be studied effectively? Two thoughts that we want to share that is critical to map the underpinnings, and the attributes of community resilience, focusing on disaster survivors' perspective. I want to take 1 minute here. We put this EMIC perspective because we experts and specialists, we interpret their data, their opinion, their aspirations, their suffering, their feelings in our own expert language. That really never bring out the real suffering, pain, success, joy, all of those things. So in this research, we turned it around and we figured out that it's more important to speak in their language through their lenses. So that's why we use EMIC perspective throughout the research, particularly with regard to the third objective that I will introduce in a few minutes. The second question in terms of a statement of the problem is, what are the major knowledge gaps in this area? To elucidate the characteristics of different livelihood options, strategies, diversification measures, these are contextual, but also there are some general underlying that we can draw upon to theorize. So that's number one. Number two, the process of enhancing livelihood resilience against shocks, stress, and perturbation. Again, as I said earlier, that it varies from fishers to farmers to other groups, but also within intergroup, because all fishers are not the same. Some fishers own boats, some fishers have nothing. Some fishers just sell their laborer. So some are skilled, some are semi-skilled. So there are a lot of differentiation within the fishers. So therefore, their context, their consequences are quite different. So how do they deal with the stresses, shocks? Do they follow same kind of trajectory, or there are differences and so on? So those are the relevant questions that we would like to explore with regard to filling in the knowledge gaps. So we have three research objectives. The general purpose is to examine the livelihood reconstruction process and community resilience in the context of post-disaster situation. We specifically looked into two cyclones. One is Cyclone Cedar and Cyclone Aila. Cyclone Cedar took place in 2007 and Cyclone Aila took place in 2009 along the coasts of Bangladesh. Our research specific objectives are three. First, we would like to examine the characteristics of changes in coastal livelihood assets due to cyclone and storm surge disaster shocks. We'll explain the assets later on, livelihood assets, different types. Second, we would like to also examine the livelihood strategies for coping, adapting, and recovering from disasters. These are basically specific measures that individuals and communities take through household measures. And the third one, what I already said, that from an EPIC perspective, that means from the communities, their perspective, from their own lenses, what are the specific attributes of livelihood resilience and locally led adaptation to cyclone and storm surge disasters? So these are the three specific objectives that we are going to pursue, and we will talk about our data collection methodologies and the presentation of the results. So let us move now to conceptual considerations. In terms of conceptual consideration, I would like to start with the very simple question that how did we frame this research? Because without conceptual framing, it is open-ended, it goes nowhere. So how did we conceptually frame it? And we used both deductive and inductive approach. That means in some cases we framed with our current existing theories. In other cases, we took the other way around. We collected the data and then drew conclusions from there. To start with, we started with assets. How a cyclone or a storm surge changes the assets matrix, assets composition in a household. We found that the best framework to deal with this assets composition and their changes in a disaster context is the sustainable livelihood framework. And many people are familiar with Ely's work, Chambers, Commerce, Conway. They introduced in the early 1990s, but a lot of studies in the rural context employed this framework. And the local livelihood approach was quite different because we're talking about individual and household level strategy they take either in a progressive way or to recover from disaster. So what kind of a specific strategy and measures they take, basically action-oriented measures, that's what we wanted to look into. The other concept that we adopted is related to livelihood resilience and adaptation at the community level. Here, we basically indicate a departure from traditional treatment of small-scale fisher as just vulnerable groups and victim of hazards. Rather, there are other underlying dimensions as well that recognizes their internal capacity and also their proactive adaptation at multiple levels, local level, household level, and also at the community level. Local level means I'm talking about individual scale. We drew some conceptual ideas from Norris et al. Explanation of resilience that describes that it is a process linking a set of adaptive capacities to a positive trajectory of functioning area adaptation after a disturbance. So these basically, talks about proactive actions that puts from a very negative scenario into a positive trajectory. So it basically differs from this conventional vulnerable and passive victim perspectives of disaster shocks to agency. Agency is basically proactive, initiative by individuals, by their own freedom of choice, and by their own freedom of action. So there has been a shift of focus that Carl Folke and others suggested, basically to look into reorganizing capacities and also to look into the flexibilities. So we framed the theory this way. It's sequential. You can see the temporal trend on the horizontal scale. On the vertical scale, we have the elements. So the first part shows the sustainability in respect to livelihood resources. If you draw from DFFM or Illis theory, then you can see that there are 5-6 capitals: human capital, cultural capital, natural capital, physical capital, social capital, financial capital. But 2 capitals are more important in the context of smaller fishes. Number 1 is social capital, not the financial capital. Social capital and the financial capital. These are the most critical, most vital resources that we are going to focus on in our analysis. Then suddenly these shocks, particularly climate change extremes, are happening throughout the world right now. We don't need to elaborate on what's happening in British Columbia right now, or in the States, or in Haiti. So when such disasters takes place, an earthquake or major storms, obviously the sustainable system, the total social ecological system, became unstable. And that instability results in breakdown of many assets when the threshold is broken up. Because threshold, basically, there is a coping capacity of each of these assets complex or asset matrix. So when threshold is crossed, then obviously many aspects of livelihood are basically face departure and disintegrated. So in perspective of livelihood, then what are the strategies? How people hold on to their occupation, or do they diversify? If they do they depart from their own old occupation, or they keep it both? So how these transform their livelihood matrix, their occupation, their income, and adjustment to new places, new occupation. So here we introduce coping adaptation in the context of temporal scale. Coping is a short-term measurement. Adaptation involves the long-term involvement. And resilience refers to inner strength to come back, but not always to the same pre-disaster situation, but rather to a new equilibrium. So that can create different type of possibilities in terms of build back better and build back with number of options, or build back forward, build back better, or sometimes build just back, or even build worst. So these are the conceptual framework. Now I would like to move to the next slide, please. So we frame our research according to that framework. So if you can remember that sustainability to unsustainability and recovery and reconstruction, these are the process oriented. So we collected detailed data on elements in each of these subsets. And Dr. Salim Uddinon now will talk about this methodology study area and also the findings. Dr. Salim, it's up to you.
Thank you, Dr. Haque. So from the conceptual framework, it was clear that we are taking multiple angles to explore our 3 targeted objectives, in this study. And to achieve these three objectives, we applied a mixed method approach. That means it's blended with the qualitative and the quantitative data with application of multiple participatory role appraisal tools. And we design multiple cases from their real life story from the victims of the fissure based on our exploratory case study model. And as mentioned earlier, we used both inductive and deductive procedures for collecting and analyzing our data. As we have something in our conceptual framework, we try to test in the field, but we find many things, many concepts that is arising from the field. And our study, we conducted our study in the southwestern part of Bangladesh. You see the red dot over here. This is the study area, and we select this study area purposely because it is repeatedly exposed to the cyclone and the storm surges, and the flooding, also salinity intrusion for a long time. And it is one of the IPCC scenario building hotspot over there for its repeated exposure. So selecting this study area, we applied three primary criteria. These three primary criteria is the degree of physical exposure to the cyclones and storm surges and the flooding. And number two is the economic base and occupational diversity. And we find that there are multiple occupations and there are many earning mode of operations are there. So this is the perfect case comparing the fisher group with the other small scale vendors or the small scale farmers over there or other occupational criteria. And we also select this study based on the previous experience from the disaster loss and damage and their reconstruction process, how they come forward or move back to the previous state, or what is the trajectory they experienced in their previous disaster, basically in Cyclone Cedar 2007 and Cyclone Isla in 2009. And to achieve these objectives, we applied a multi-stage study design. That means this is the whole country, and we select a cyclone-prone area, the Patuakhali district, and then we go to the sub-district, that is the Kolapara, and we select two union out of 12 unions of Kolapara. You see from the graph, from the figure, that this is Dulashar is the shoreline community. This is the union. Union is the lowest most administrative unit of Bangladesh. So, and this is more dynamic due to the exposure to the estuary and the Bay of Bengal. And we also select one inland community, that is the Nilganj area, basically to compare with the fisher and the farmer. So Dulashar is a newly established union, and it is more dynamic, and most of the inhabitants are fisher in nature. But in Nilganj, there is blending. We find that a significant portion is fisher along with the major farming community. And to our field data were collected by using 300 household head survey. So we get all our victims of the Cyclone Cedar and Isla, and we have a comprehensive list from the local institution like the voter list. And then we took the sample by random sampling procedure. And we conducted 8 focus group discussion, irrespective of their color, ethnicity, gender, and their sexual orientation. So we get a very blended male, female, bureaucrats and NGO personnel, local elites, school teachers. So we get a very diverse phenomenon over there and diverse perspective from their focus group discussion. Then we conducted 20 key informant interview, basically the local administrator, Union Parishad chairman, members, and the local cyclone preparedness program members, and the local elites who are very knowledgeable to authenticate and validate our data or triangulate our data. So this is the 3 tools that we applied for collecting our data in the field. Then we analyze it. So we have three objectives in our study. First objective deals with the changes in coastal livelihood assets due to cyclone and storm surge, disaster shocks, basically the post-disaster, how their asset changes and what was the impact. So from the right side, you can see that there is a table that describes the socio-demographic characteristics of the sample household. And out of the whole 300 household survey, we find that more than 25% respondent were fisher group, and that is dominant in the Dulashar union, that is the onshore union. And we see that the income level is very, very low. Their monthly income is less than $118. Most of the people, that is the 56% of the respondent, they have less than or equals to $118 per month. And regarding the farmland ownership, we find that the only more than 40% people are landless. Basically, they don't have farming land, and that is in response of in reference to their ownership. So he's only 40 people, 40% people own their farmland, but we find the significant portion, more than 60% people, they don't have their own farmland to cultivate and do some agriculture work. So it is clear that from the data we find there are 25% is the fisher, and that is dominated in the Dulashar union. Is more than 46% respondent is occupied with fishing as their means of livelihoods. And our study find that, very interestingly, that more than 26% cyclone victims, they changed their occupation. And we categorize our data into two sectors for its critical analysis: the intrasectoral and the intersectoral. I will go to details in the next slide, but just giving a thought that intrasectoral, that means they are changing their occupation within their occupational silo. So for example, there is a fisherman when he lost his boat and net, but he started group fishing with other people, or he started the small scale bending of the fish, or he started giving labor to the other fisher or the fishing related sector. And intersectoral is the completely opting out from their previous occupation. That means he was a fisher, but right now he turned into a businessman. Now he turned into a fisher farmer. So this we find is a significant portion, 26% people, as a strategy of coping with the disaster and adaptation with the disaster, they change their occupation. And I mentioned that we compared with the farming, and farming was found more stable than the fishing because fisher has to face multiple vulnerability, multiple risk at the same time, because they are landless and they don't have other diversified income at that time, and they are more vulnerable. But we find that they are taking proactive initiative to secure their livelihoods, and after facing this kind of disaster, cyclone and Ila. And we also documented that they are learning, the fisher, they are learning from the previous disaster. They are taking preparation for combating with the future disaster. And also we find that they are diversifying their livelihoods. For example, he was a fisher before the cyclone Cedar, and after that he diversified. He took a small grant or the loan from the government or the NGOs. Then he invested in small scale farming or small scale business, like the establishing a tea stall side by side. When he off to the fishing, then he start, or he's one of the family member taking care of the other small scale. If they have multiple options of their earning, then they should not be break down after the disaster. If he lost his boat or net, but he can bounce back or bounce forward to a different trajectories, because he engaged his family member and the other person residing in their own family. So there will be multiple pockets of earning. And it is critical that they are self-organizing. You know, in Bangladesh, basically, people have to reestablish, reorganize, reconstructions by himself, and they have to take some kind of training provided by the government and non-government organization, and they are building their, enhancing their capacity, and they are learning from and facing this kind of disaster for the centuries. This is not the only cyclone Sidor or Ayla, but they have to, and their forefathers also, they are facing a long time, and they have typical mentality within themselves that even I find that within 1 week after a disaster shock, they devastated everything. They started their business. They started their fishing. They went to the sea for fishing within this turmoil condition. So this is the inner capacity within the fisher that we find that they are not breaking down, but still they have the capability to coming back to their previous or the moving forward. And this table describes about the loss and damage due to the cyclones, and Dr. Haque mentioned about the DFID model from Ellis and others. So it is really critical to dig into the financial, human, physical, natural, and the cultural capitals along with the social capital. So our research find that there was a severe shock, severe loss in their financial, human, and physical, and the natural capitals. For example, we find that more than 78% in the Nilganj Union, 94% in the Dulashar Union reported that somehow their livelihoods are disrupted, devastated. And we find that within this small two union, more than 30 people were died due to the disaster, but most of them reported that due to the uprooting of the trees and some of the fisher in the estuary, they were not able to come back to their the shore onset of this disaster. And we also find that more than 86% and 90% in the Dulashar Union, their housing structure and their boats, nets, and other assets or physical assets are devastated. And also it was important because some of the small scale fisher, they lives on the fish fry catching or some other small scale fishing, and also some aquaculture. But we also find that due to the salinity intrusion, severe salinity, their soil or for farmers, their soil were unproductive, and they lost their other means of earning due to the salinity intrusion and the tidal surges. So those are critical. And finally, the social capital, that the network bonding with each other, that plays a critical role, and the social as a community, how they respond to these kind of shocks and stresses, that was critical. And we find that there is still tremendous bonding with each other within the society, neighbor to neighbor, their kinship. We find that he's a fisher, he lost his boat and net, his house was devastated, but a relative residing in the urban area, he sent money to buy the boat and net. Even we find that they are sharing their labor to each other for rebuilding their livelihoods, and they're reconstructing their houses, they are sharing with each other. And as a community, there are a lot of formal and informal organization, they are helping tremendously to overcome this kind of situation. So that was really fascinating to explore this kind of local assets, and how these kind of assets and the capitals help them to rebuild from this kind of disaster after a massive shock. And number two objective, we look into the livelihood strategies for coping, adapting, and the recoveries from the disaster. And there is a two comparison. We did livelihood change across the study union, two union, and it was found that within the change, I mentioned that there are 26% people or the respondent that changed their occupation. And we find that both cases, both intersectoral and the intrasectoral cases, that we find that the Dulashar Union that is residing, located at the onshore area, they were forced and bound to change their occupation to cope with the situation and adapt with the cyclone shocks and stresses, in comparison with the inland area. This is the Nilganj, where so we see that the intersectoral changes, we find the 54% people in the Dulashar Union, they change their occupation, and intersectoral we find that 70%. So I earlier I mentioned that intersectoral, that means within their livelihood silo, that means a fisher, he lost his net and board, then he started a small business, he started fishing with the other people as a group fishing, or he's giving labor to the catching fish, or going or running their boat, or even in engaging within the vendors for fishing business. But we also find the significant portion, they changed, completely opted out from their previous occupation. He was a fisher, he turned into a farmer. He was a fisher, he turned into a small scale vendor. He was a fisher, he started to driving an auto bike. So we see that people, they don't wait for a long time. And it is really fascinating that I mentioned within 1 week after this traumatized condition, they started their, because they know that if they don't earn, their family will be in the starvation. There will be no food purchase, but they also get help from the external sources for the time being, not for a long time, to get some relief work and from supports from the government and non-government organization. But they don't rely on this kind of sources. They started their process, and we also find that they took this initiative very proactively. Find that they are prepared for a cyclone. There is a warning, then they're stockpiling. The fisher, I find that they're stockpiling their fishing nets and gears, and they are planning that how they should respond within this kind of situation. And they also, I'll just talk about this process, resilience building process, in the next slide. But they were very proactive, they were very resilient, I find, in that particular area, though they are losing their near and dear one. And they also, there is a huge havoc and the loss and damage of their physical and the other properties over there. And in comparison with the livelihood changes across the occupation, we find major 3 to 4 occupation, like the fishing, farming, vendor, or the daily or seasonal worker. And we find that a significant portion who completely changed their occupation, that means the intersectoral changes, we find that the seasonal worker or the daily worker, they opted out their previous occupation after the disaster shock. But our focus is on the smaller scale fishing, and we find that most of the fisher, they change their occupation intrasectorally within their silo, because they know, they have the skill, they have the knowledge about how to catch fish, how to market it, and how to deal with this kind of catching fish. So basically they are more inclined within their silo, that intrasectoral shift they took after the disaster as a response to the disaster and coping with this kind of disaster. And I mentioned that there was a majority of the respondents engaged in the daily worker. They opted out completely. They changed their occupation. That was the 86% of the fisher within the changed occupation. And fishing, the fisher, they changed their occupation intra and intersectorally, both 41% who changed their occupation. And out of this changing occupation, there are 32% people and they who occupied as a bending or the trading, a small scale trading, they changed and opted out from their previous occupation. And it is fascinating to know that the people, the seasonal migrating worker who comes this shore area or this coastal areas for temporary to catch fish or doing farming, it is very interesting that more than 4.22 times more likely they change their permanent settlement, change their occupation than the permanent settled area people in that particular area. And this data was, this changes of their occupation was significant in our statistical analysis. We conducted multivariate analysis, and order logistic regression shows that the fisher, they are 5.23 times likely to change their occupation than the farming in reference to farming, and trading 4.3 to 1, and seasonal worker, we mentioned that 66.9, that is more likely to change their occupation than the farm in reference to farming. The big question is that I mentioned that were they forced or proactively dynamic? we find they are proactively dynamic. They don't wait for their loss and damage. They don't wait for their external sources. They started building their resilience. They started building their livelihood just aftermath of the disaster. And even prior to the disaster, they were prepared how to repair their livelihoods, how to repair their means of earning. So it is really important. They have in their learning, they are learning a lot from their previous disaster, and they are taking proactive steps based on their learning and their social bonding and their other social capitals within their social fabrics. So number third objective was to explore the livelihood resilience factor. We applied Folke et al.'s cluster of resilience building factors and focusing on the emic perspective. Dr. Haque mentioned about that. It is insider view. It is the victim's perspective. So our ethic perspective may not applicable for all cases, but we have preset ethic perspective, but emic perspective is more important to get into within their problems, identify their problems by themselves, so getting out their solution from themselves. So we explored the resilience building factor and the local-led adaptation process under three strategies. One, living with the change and uncertainty. We know that any disaster that brings uncertainty, and they are taking risk all time because they are shoreline community or pretty close to the Bay of Bengal, and they are experiencing repeatedly with the cyclones and this kind of disaster storm surges. So how they are taking different strategies and building their own resilience, enhancing their own resilience. And we find that they are learning from the previous crisis or their crisis and building a portfolio of livelihood options. I mentioned that they are stockpiling. They are selecting alternative livelihood activities as a means of diversification. And we see that they are using their social capital as a network, and they also engaged in exchanging of their labor to rebuild their livelihood and increased mobility for earning. They are not stick to only one occupation. They are moving, running. I find that basically when the farmer fishers went to sea for fishing, but their household members, especially his spouse, is not residing. He's moving. He's trying to selling some teas, small scale bending, or doing household work, or rearing the cows or the cattle. So they are trying to diversify their options, and they are trying to reach a very satisfactory life to get more earning. Number two was nurturing learning and adaptation. This is critical, and we find that they are nurturing their learning and taking adaptation process in course of time. For example, they are planting trees around their homestead and the rural roads and the coastal embankments. And coastal embankments is a common property resources, and they are recalling the importance of coastal embankments and plantation. It was said that more than 86% respondents said that Sundarbans mangrove forests saved their lives from Cyclone Cedar and Isla. So that is critical factor to manage these coastal embankments and the plantations. And also we find that they are nurturing the diversity of institution to respond to disaster. For example, they are involving with the local-led initiatives, Union Disaster Management Committee, Cyclone Preparedness Program, self-help group membership, and they are also distributing the relief and rehabilitation, and they are taking loans to diversify their income as a means of nurturing their learning and adaptation process, so that they can adapt with this kind of changes. It might be climate change induced, it might be natural, or any kind of disasters that are getting. And number third one was the creating opportunities for self-organization and the capacity building. And they are, each and every time they are engaged, there are multiple local or local government or non-government organization are working over there, and they are trying to building their capacity so that they can, within withstand within the shocks, though they have inbuilt capacity within themselves. And we find that they are solving problems in managing their common properties like fishing in the sea, or managing the embankment, plantations, or other available resources, or the karstland resources, so that there is no conflict within the community. They are solving their problems by themselves. And also they are taking proactive initiative like elevating their homestead from the previous tidal surges level or the flooding level. They are building stronger houses within their capacity, and they are engaging in alternative livelihood options. So we find that this resilience building factors is multi-level at the multi-scale. And Dr. Haque mentioned that they started from the individual level to the household to the community, and broader umbrella. And we also see that they are interacting with the horizontal institutions and the vertical institutions. So we see that both interaction at the multi-level and the multi-scale, so that they can reconstruct their livelihoods in a sustainable way. They want to be better than the previous occupation, previous earning. And these resilience building factors are interacting across temporal and the spatial scales. So we find that they are learning, and they are doing proactive initiative, and they are preparing for the future disaster. So these are the three objectives that we achieve by our methods and our data analysis. I am handing over to Dr. Haque for the discussion and the conclusion part. So it's over to Dr. Haque. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salim, for presenting all the results in a very articulated way. The people who are interested in our topic, we published this work in a journal called International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. So it came out this year, volume 63, International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. So you would like to, look into the details, you can find it there. I'm referring to this article because I want to keep my discussion and conclusion crisp rather than elaborating all the details. So my first issue to discuss is that what is the take-home message from this study? What's the big deal about this article? Well, as many conventional studies, again and again, there are hundreds of studies that showed that fishers, small-scale fishers, are vulnerable and they're victims. And they're victims, and they're also labeled as passive agents. In our study, I can cite many examples, like after Emdad Haque, Ismail, and many studies have shown that these victims, basically, they get marginalized, over time and so on, and they never can come back. They become destitute and they get lost in the social fabric. In our case, what we have found that yes, they get devastated, but people are a lot more aware of the environment and the opportunities. And another element is that there's aspiration to do better even before the cyclones or before the storm surges. Some younger people, they aspire because of the major changes, they find that this is an opportunity for them to do even better. So that aspiration and awareness, I think, are the two major drivers for them to try. But in that trial, it's not necessarily they will succeed, because they need some kind of intervention and help. As Dr. Salim mentioned, that this type of help can come from the institutions, external institutions, international donor agencies, government donor agencies, and financial institutions. I myself have pursued primary study in Brazil, in Parachi area, in Atlantic coast area, and found out that smaller scale fishers were reluctant to go on board with governmental credit provisions for fishers. The reason being they're afraid of red tape, bureaucracy, whereas in Bangladesh coast, it's other way around. They rely more on microcredit, smaller scale microcredit institutions, because that kind of help can put them on track and they can come back and even do better within very few, years time. And Dr. Salim Uddinon mentioned about a number of cases in that regard. So when that is the scenario, we can enhance institutional role that will work not for themselves, but to enhance the capacity that is already built in. So it's not rather external, rather internalizing that help will make the difference. So we have to look at the resilience attributes and so on, as Dr. Salim Uddinon mentioned, that from their emic perspective, it is very clear that their own language, their own narratives are quite different. That means they are confident as long as they get the necessary help, emergency help, and they can streamline and explore different diversified options. For example, some people move to the cities, they stayed for 3, 4, 5 years, they earned, they saved, and they came back, and they restart another business in locality. I'm just giving an example. We have seen many, many cases. People take this type of temporary or short-term measures, and they really cope very, very well, as long as there are support either from social capital, that is local network, or from institutions. So institutions need to explore into this and support them better. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in terms of further research, we can see that this institution assistance should be targeting to help enhancing self-capacity enhancement of fishers communities to deal with the emerging risk and disaster shocks, because their own strength is going to ultimately make the difference. And also what is missing in the literature, that these transformational processes, which fits very much into this V2V project mandate, because it conceptualizes victims to viability. So viability obviously will require identifying and mapping these transformational elements, because traditional conventional thinking was that only education, well, education, formal education, they will not have that kind of social support system and so on. Rather, these transformational changes will require more understanding of the awareness and aspiration, and working with them to help them to build the necessary financial infrastructure and also physical infrastructure. In that way, there will be more risk reduction and also resilience. I think I'll stop there, and then we can answer some of the questions. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you very much, both Emdad and Salim Uddinon, and really wonderful, empirical case study based, findings there, and then focusing on, how can there be resilient livelihoods in the small scale fishing communities of not only Bangladesh, but lots of learning for other contexts. So we have now about 15 minutes to have questions. So, and we have already started receiving questions from our audience, and for the benefit of everyone that is watching over YouTube, I will read out the questions to both of you, and you may please respond. The first one is from Salorm Danjator, who is asking, how do we calculate the resilience level of the diversified livelihoods?
Let me just take first shot, and then Dr. Salim can respond to it. Resilience level of livelihoods, in the literature, resilience can be measured in both qualitatively and with some proxy substitute quantitatively. Obviously, the established scholar prefer more qualitative approach to livelihood, resilience to diversified livelihood. So we have to look at the resilience characteristics. Resilience characteristics is obviously the capacity to come back from shocks. So what are those capacities? Again, financial, physical, social, all those capacities. But what is important in resilience is self-organizing capacity from shocks. I think that's everybody emphasizes So those are the qualitative measurements. In quantitative measurements, Salim Uddinon himself did some studies on indexing different attributes. So you can convert them into different type of quantified indexing, and the literature is available. Dr. Salim Uddinon published one of those articles in the journal Environment. It's called Journal of Environmental Management. So Salorm, you can find that, or we can send you that reference. Dr. Salim, it's up to you.
Thank you, sir. So at the conceptual framework, we started our understanding as resilience as a process linking adaptive trajectory. So we just only documented the process oriented, not the outcome oriented. Outcome oriented, basically, you will find lots of literature and lots of documents that is published by international organization. They want to see their result in the monetary value. But our one, we went beyond the scope of this measurement area, because we know we don't have the, most of the case, we see that people are bypassing their qualitative attributes. But our one, and the most of the school of thoughts, they are believing or thinking in the line of process linking trajectories, process linking resilience building. We focus on the attributes, the social fabrics, like the social network. So how you see how it works in the reconstruction of the livelihoods within the small scale features. And we also find the people place connection. I find that I ask them, if I build a stronger house in the hill area, will you move? No, because they said that this is my birthplace, this is the graveyard of my ancestors is there, I will never leave this place. So you see the bonding, their attachment with the land, as like as you can find in the developed nation here in Canada and the other areas, their people are so connected within their place, and they are bonding social capital and other linkage, vertical and the horizontal linkage. So we focus on the process linking oriented, the resilience building. Now the quantification, we can quantify in the number, and as Dr. Haque mentioned that we have several different publications based on our resilience attributes and its implications within this coastal context. If you are interested, please just shoot me an email. I'll send you right away. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much for that response. So there is a small request here from Araba Aful, who is saying, if you can copy and paste the link to the paper that Dr. Haque mentioned, Salim or Dr. Haque can do that on the chat. So the next question is from Maha Abdul Basit, who is asking, do we have a categorization of SSF? And she is asking this question to suggest, if there can be there can be different livelihood resilience protocols that can be developed based on different criteria for different groups of small-scale fisheries, and is that doable?
I would rather request Dr. Pradeep to answer this question. Then obviously there will be some regional variation. There is no universal categorization, I think, but Dr. Pradeep might be able to highlight on that. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I mean, you have answered this partly because, your study was specific to one particular reason. Of course, there are implications for, applying the learnings and the findings to other contexts. But this specific livelihood resilience protocols, as the question asks, can be very specific to this context. So if we look at the broad categorization of SSF, SSF in itself is not defined in one single way. Depends on how we define and what definition of small-scale fisheries fishers we take, and to that effect, how these protocols or how these guidelines can be developed for livelihood resilience, and at the same time, the exposure to the cyclones or the natural disaster will define the nature of the protocols itself. So broadly, I would say that, but I will not take more time because it's yours. So
it's doable. I think scholars are doing it according to their own context. That's what I have seen so far too.
Yes, yeah. And then the next question is from Sisip Pradhan. How do we look at this issue as against the overall development trends in the country? And such trends are creating more opportunities for people involved in other sectors. So I think it's a good question that is asking, the push and pull factor for people moving out and into fisheries.
I find that's a very interesting question, very valid question, because all what is happening at the local level nowadays, in a very globalized environment, it cannot happen without the macro perspective. So overall development trend, how can we look at in this kind of context? I would start with fishing trade, because trade is the starting point where you can see the commodity goes and the value is created. And without that value creation and materialization at the local level, these communities will not sustain. So that's the starting point. And secondly, other information exchanges, like for example, in Bangladesh, mobile phone, what we know in the Western world, cell phone communication changed hugely in terms of this market exchanges and so on. Also, different type of bargaining and market exchanges. So I think those are the elements that interconnects the macro and micro level would be a way to go to look into the overall development trends. If I design a study like that, that's the way I will go, rather than treating those skills separately. That how are they connected? What are the interfaces? And how are they impacting each other? That will be my way to proceed.
The next question is from Royal Miha. Thank you, Dr. Haque and Dr. Uddinon, for your excellent presentation. What is the most common adaptation strategy taken by coastal Bangladesh people after an extreme event?
Well, we make a distinction between coping strategy and adaptation strategy. In terms of coping strategy, basically neighbors, relatives, they help by providing different cereals, cash, water, as much as they can. These are coping. And also they try to provide other connections, so that they can survive through meeting immediate necessities. In terms of adaptation strategies, I would say a number of adaptation strategies they take. One is physical adaptation. Obviously, they try to physically do their housing better, their crops, more adapted so that they can withstand. But in addition to this physical, they also go for, diversification of their occupation. They also sometimes migrate from one place to another, but these are both temporary migration, but also this migration takes place with returnees. They come back and they reinvest. The bottom line is that nowadays everybody thinks that market gives an opportunity, and whatever investment they can make, they go for it in terms of even adaptation.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Dr. Haque. If you permit, then I can add some specific example of adaptation. This is really important issue of the adaptation, and you clearly distinguished between the coping and adaptation. So adaptation is a long-term process to adapt with them within the changes. So I find that, as for example, farmers, they are planting the saline tolerant varieties, and they also choosing the short rotation crop varieties, because so that they can harvest before the storm surges or the cyclone. And in case of fisher, I find that the most important diversification of their livelihood isn't basically as an adaptive tool and mechanism. And I also find that they are doing some of the group work, so that they're forming the cooperatives and they started group fishing, so that if there is a loss of their net and board, their burden will be very less, and they can earn more money because they have a bigger board and they can stay in the sea for a long time. So we see lots of changes along with the physical and the other structural changes, that, for example, they are elevating their household plinth. They are constructing their houses is more stronger, like moving from the thatching house to the tin or corrugated iron sheet, or to the semi-structured, semi-building or the building structure. So that's all. Thank you.
several more questions. So the next one is by Pankaj Tiwari, which is about the long run. What happens in the long run? Are intersectoral changes after Cyclone Sox beneficial or detrimental to the fishermen community, in particular in Bangladesh in general? I think
Okay, to
it's
the
very
point,
interesting question.
this question, basically intersectoral changes in the disaster, post-disaster context is a survival strategy. So they try to, cope with it in a survival strategy. And sometimes a businessman, for example, become a daily laborer. So for her or for him, it's very difficult to, see the benefits because they are already devastated. However, in the long run, what we have seen in our empirical work, it opens up other opportunities as well. So overall, in the long run, these intersectoral changes bring positive and beneficial returns, but it depends on the case by case, because some people continue with their, very degraded conditions, very precarious socioeconomic conditions.
Yeah,
but generally positive. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and related to that question, Pankaj is also asking, are institutions doing enough to re-establish the fishers, given the current trends?
Salim, you can the field, then I will say my comment.
I think the overall question is, is there an, what is the institutional response to this social learning that is taking place in the community?
Thank you. In structural and organized way, still there is a huge gap of this local level policy implementation and local level initiative, especially from the government side. But a lot of NGO and those familiar with in Bangladesh and the South Asian context, they know about the rule of the non-government organizations. They are doing a lot to reestablish them from the previous condition and reconstructing their livelihoods. They are providing incentive, they are providing loans, short-term and long-term loans, interest-free or with interest. So they're also helping them by doing lots of projects by themselves so that they can reconstruct their livelihoods aftermath of this disruption. But in the institutional establishment, still there is a long way to go. And government, we also are good in our paper that is a context specific, because people in coastal areas, they have different vulnerability and they have different their resilience building capacities in comparison with the mainland community. So the policies and the programs and initiative should be context specific and should be focused on the marginalized group rather than the broader. Okay, Dr. Haque, please.
Pankaj, I just want to say that if you look at it from global perspective, in Haiti, what has happened that people had no, support at all for many, many weeks even. In Bangladesh, what I would suggest is that institutional support has already been institutionalized. Mm-hmm. So not only just government work, there are gaps. I agree with my co-author that gaps, but it has already been institutionalized. Many NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs, they have everything, packaged. So when there is a disaster, it just, immediately get acted. So, in Bangladesh, that's why we see a lot of success stories in terms of resilience, because it has already been institutionalized very effectively.
Thank you. And the next question is from Faluke Ariola. Thank you very much for a good presentation. I'm interested in knowing if there are established institutions structured to assist SSF after disasters. I think the question is related to the previous one, government, NGO, civil society in Bangladesh. I think you have partly responded to that.
Are we missing Anna, Carolina?
Yeah, we're missing one.
Okay, you can respond to this and then we can go to Anna. Yeah.
Yeah, so you said that is being marginalized a key element for adaptation? Not necessarily, because adaptation, a person without a disaster victim, when his or her aspiration gets changed, want to do better and take proactive actions. We have seen many, many examples. that people take initiative, they invest in children education instead of investing some other business. We have seen different type of matrix adjustment and so on. So not necessarily marginalized people obviously is forced to think about their adaptation options more, but other people also, without being marginalized, also can take adaptive measures.
Okay.
And the next question is
from Anna, and I'm really sorry, Anna, that I skipped you. Thank you very much for your informative presentation. Is being marginalized a key element for adaptation?
Yeah, we answered that one. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Anna is referring to are people being forced to adapt because they are in certain social and economic conditions. So yeah. Okay. And I have one. I think we are at time. Should we take one more question, Dr. Haque and Dr. Uddinon?
I think there's the last one. Poluke.
Yeah, you answered that. I asked that before.
Yeah.
Okay. There is one from Derek Armitage, and the question is, the focus on agency and locally led capacity building is crucial, and the insights provided are really helpful in this regard. Every context is different, but I am wondering if in this context, the focus on local resilience building is a strategic way for higher level governments to offload responsibility, or if there is a well-developed way to build a multi-level governance approach that requires active engagement of governments to enable local resilience. It's again related, but if you want to reflect on that question.
Yeah, I think Derek's point is very, very valid, very, very important one. Our study was an exploratory one because in Bangladesh context, this disaster resilience, we have seen a lot of papers, but they are very generalized. Only very, very few nailed it down to look into specific elements of what this resilience means. I'm talking about resilience to disasters and livelihood reconstruction. So therefore, further studies need to be done in terms of understanding these specific elements at the local level. But we clearly concluded that there are happenings. There are a lot of stories that we told and we have seen that people are taking proactive measures by using their agency. So the materialization of this agency is happening on the ground, whether we academician record it or not. But that's happening, is proven in many, many facets. Now, the next question, is it going to open up the downloading of institutional responsibility? To some extent, it might, but it depends on the governance systems. So if there is a pluralistic governance and some degree of accountability, that connects to our another paper that Dr. Salim published, we published together, that what is the degree of local level implementation of these national policies? And we found big gaps there. So in terms of governance, there are very poor structure, accountability is very poor, a lot of corruptions. So yes, if the senior government or national government is corrupt and want to download by using that, these local communities are resilient, we don't need to support them. They can use that. But I think there are enough pressure groups in Bangladesh right now, interest groups, that's unlikely to happen because media plays a big role and social media also plays a big role. So it's moving ahead with different type of checks and balances. And I don't think in Bangladesh context, offloading will sustain for a long time, but there could be some elements of it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we are at time, and thank you very much to both Dr. Haque and Dr. Uddinon for that wonderful presentation, but also the very lively discussion based on the questions from our audience and participants here. Before we end this, thank you very much to our audience who is joining from all parts of the world on the live stream on YouTube. I'm inviting Sabil Baranji, who is our project coordinator of V2V Global Partnership, to bring up the announcement for the next month's B2B Global Partnership thematic webinar. As I mentioned, we do it every month on the last Friday. So I have the pleasure of inviting all of you to the next month, September installment of the thematic webinar series, which is going to be a talk by Dr. Derek Johnson from the University of Manitoba, the same institutions that Dr. Haque and Dr. Haque comes now, and I'm sure, and I know Dr. Uddinon studied there. Derek Johnson's talk is going to be titled as Vulnerability and Viability in Dried Fish Social Economies. And please use the same YouTube link to join us on 24th September for this another interesting and wonderful talk by Dr. Derek Johnson. So I bring this to a close, and this was a wonderful experience of listening and being in a discussion and debate.
Appreciate very much.
Thank you, Dr. Prateep and your team, B2B Partnership Project teams, for inviting us, and it was really, really interesting. And
we enjoyed because it fits to the
mission
and mandate of the project.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your invitation.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye now.